Hello and welcome to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. First, some good news. The Hated and the Dead has been selected to appear on Podcast Radio, a digital radio station in the United States that plays podcast episodes back-to-back in a traditional format. The 5 selected episodes of this podcast won't be broadcast on there until autumn, but it's great news, and I'll let you know exactly when, closer to the time. This week, The Hated and the Dead returns to Africa, looking at Liberian warlord-turned-politician Charles Taylor. Merely describing Taylor as Liberia's president conceals an unbelievable biography, including military training with former hated and dead subject Colonel Gaddafi, escape from a maximum security prison, the overthrow and murder of Liberia's President Samuel Doe in the late 1980s, and the instigations of revolutions in multiple West African countries. Following over a decade of near-constant civil war in Liberia, Charles Taylor resigned the office of president in 2003 and was eventually found guilty of war crimes. He is now imprisoned in County Durham in northern England. While on trial in The Hague, the court heard of Taylor forcing his soldiers to practice cannibalism on their enemies, among other heinous crimes, an attitude towards violence encapsulated in his 1997 campaign slogan, "He killed my ma, he killed my pa, but I'll vote for him." Taylor's story tells us a lot about the mechanics of violence and coercion during both war and peace, and his effect on Liberia, a country still reeling from his reign of terror but also showing signs of moving on, has to be understood with these mechanics in mind. My guest for today is Dr Christine Cheng, Senior Lecturer in International Relations at King's College London. Christine has a keen interest in Liberia, a country with a fascinating history, and her 2019 book, Extralegal Groups in Post-Conflict Liberia, How Trade Makes the State, won the Conflict Research Society's annual prize. She also comments on international affairs for the BBC, The Wall Street Journal, and Al-Jazeera. As well as examining the trials and tribulations of Taylor's life, we had an illuminating discussion about the record of the West at bringing war criminals to justice. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Charles Taylor. Hi Christine, how's it going?
Great, thanks for having me, Tom.
It's a pleasure. Christine, we're talking about Charles Taylor today. He was the president of Liberia between 1997 and 2003. He's often referred to as a warlord. To set up our conversation, first of all, why have you devoted quite a big portion of your career to studying Charles Taylor? What do you think is notable and interesting about him?
Taylor is an absolutely fascinating character, and he's fascinating in so many ways, in part for the lessons that we in the West should learn about how to deal with non-state actors who become state actors, right? They are the most interesting. So people who start from one side as rebel actors and then come into power. And then, of course, now he has been tried for war crimes in Sierra Leone, actually, and sits in the UK, in Franklin Jail, just outside of Durham. So actually, he's right here, not too far away from where you and I sit, Tom. But just in terms of, my personal interest, my interest is actually in Liberia and in state building and in state formation. And I come at these topics in part, if you understand Charles Taylor, you understand a lot of what the kind of person that, I guess, does well through war and the mechanisms through which he does well through war. So in this particular case, it's really understanding natural resources and the role that they played and how he exploited them really, really well, as quite an inventive businessman, if you want to put it in those terms. And yes, along with being both a statesman and a warlord, right? So he held, I would say, many different positions at the same time. And that's part of the fascination, but also the lens through which we look at these issues and how we process somebody like him. I don't think we know what to do with him because he doesn't fit neatly into any of our boxes. And the fact that we don't see him fitting neatly into our boxes is what makes it fascinating for us to think about ourselves, right? So all of those things, I think, make both Charles Taylor and Liberia and the war to peace transition in Liberia super fascinating.
Liberia is a country with a very interesting founding principle, founding moment. Can you tell us a bit about Liberia and how it became a country initially? You mentioned state building there.
So Liberia, the story, the myth of Liberia is a glorious one, right? The narrative of Liberia is one of freed slaves who left the U.S. and founded a new country, but that clashes with the reality of that, of what actually happened. And I think that's the difficulty. Everybody needs a narrative to, feel patriotic about where they come from, but that myth and the reality are quite harshly juxtaposed against one another. So the myth is, way back in the 1800s, the American Colonization Society had there were a number of freed slaves in the U.S., and then the American Colonization Society said, hey, you know what? A bunch of people, both on the left and the right of the spectrum, who, for their own variety of political reasons, wanted to support that return of these freed slaves so they could go back to Africa and set up their own republic. And that, led to some of the missions that the American Colonization Society supported through the early 1800s. And then, that finally succeeded in 1820 or so. And then, that turned into what is now Liberia. But that moment, when all of these things happened, when they actually first got that first piece of land successfully, it was a pretty violent moment. They came over with the Navy, and they had a captain of the Navy, Robert Stockton, came up and took a gun and held it against the barrel of the gun against the head of one of the local chiefs, King Peter, and said, you better hand over this land or else. So there was this nominal trade of land for about $300, again, in 1821 days, right? Worth of goods, pots, pans, beads, basically what we would today consider to be tat, right? And they got 130 acres for that $300 at the end of a barrel of a gun. And that was the founding of Liberia. So immediately in that founding moment, you have this juxtaposition of U.S. intervention and those freed slaves and those settler slaves coming from the antebellum South, right? That's the environment through which they have understood the world. They land in another place, and everybody else they would consider to be native, uncivilized. And, on the other side of things, from King Peter's side and, the people in the local region, in this case, it was, the Bassa and King Peter's tribe separately, they had their own issues in dealing with the locals because they were involved in the slave trade themselves, right? So you've got these two different ideas of how they wanted to run things, like how governance should run. And that immediately led to a clash, right? So there's this back and forth between the two, and it just got uglier and messier. And that was the founding moment.
And something of an irony, I suppose, and you've already alluded to it, that freed slaves from the southern United States taking a journey across an ocean to take over land of other Africans, right? I mean, if we look at Taylor was born in 1948. I don't know kind of the degree to which it's Liberia's status as a free man's kind of haven from the 19th century has commanded much sway into the 20th century. But what was Liberia like when Taylor was a child? I imagine that at least the tension between the kind of the American Liberians and the natives, as you put it, must have still been there when he was born.
It absolutely was. And the interesting thing, well, many interesting things about Taylor, but one of them was that he was half and half. He was,
right.
His mom was Gola, and his dad was Americo, right? So he sort of had a foot in both worlds. He was middle class from the Americo side, but he understood and could have links back to the native Liberian side. And those tensions were definitely there, and you saw them rising up through the 1960s and 70s as, you saw decolonization going on around the world and different African countries demanding their independence. And even though that wasn't really quite the same dynamic in Liberia, because it had always been an independent country and always been ruled by not colonized anyway, in theory, right? So not colonized in theory, but that it was much more of an apartheid state than I think anybody would ever want to admit, right? Being ruled by one very small set of people, making up about 4%, between 1 and 4%, depending on how you count them, of the population. These Americo-Liberians, some would call them, sometimes they call themselves Congos, right? So as a class of people, about 4% of the population ruling over the other 96% of the population, controlling the vast majority of wealth, of the professions, of business, politics, everything, right? This is all really under the control of this very, very small part of the population. And so the rest of the population is clamoring for more access to power, to education, to opportunities. And that tension is there, right? And it kind of erupts. And that's the beginning of where you see things falling apart. Because up to that point, Liberia had really been the bastion of stability in Africa, which is kind of crazy for us to think about, right? But it was one of, and had long been, if not the most prosperous country in Africa, at least one of the most prosperous countries in Africa. So it's really different from how we think about it today. It used to be seen as just the most stable place in Africa.
That was a prosperity that I think largely Taylor shared in. You mentioned that he was pretty middle class. I think it was a fairly privileged upbringing, really, wasn't it? And he went to university in the United States.
He did indeed. And, he learned from both sides there, right? So he had access to these structures. But again, he sat on both sides of this, because later on, when Doe came into power, Taylor was also able to take advantage of that, right? So this is he gets to be a bit of a chameleon, a political chameleon. And he came in on the coattails of Thomas Kiompa, who Kiompa and Doe together were really the ring. Well, it was actually Kiompa who was the ringleader of overthrowing that Americo-Liberian regime and overthrowing the Tolbert regime at the time and giving power, in theory, to the native Liberians, the rest of the country, the other 96% of the country. And, Taylor was part of that movement. So he had a place on Doe's administration as a comptroller of sorts. And he was in charge of the General Services Administration, which was basically public procurement. Right? So he had a relatively influential role in that government until the point where Thomas Kiompa decided that, things were getting out of hand with Doe and started leading a bit of a movement against him, right? So you could see this kind of behind the scenes, like the preparations to overthrow Doe. And then there was a lot of back and forth violence between Doe and the Kron that he represented. And then the groups that Thomas Kiompa represented. And that got ugly, really ugly. And so people could see that this was going down a pretty dark path. Essentially, Doe was doing exactly what had been done before. So instead of having the Americo-Liberians rule now and handing out their patronage to other Americo-Liberians, you now have Samuel Doe doing exactly the same thing, but now doing it with the crown, right? So you just basically see this repeat, this pattern repeat of patronage and corruption, but now with violence.
So just to take a couple of steps back there, Doe became the leader of Liberia in 1980, is that right?
1980, yes.
1980. And he was a native Liberian rather than an Americo-Liberian. I think that you mentioned there that Doe and Taylor had some sort of, kind of perhaps quite transactional relationship in government, but I think they fell out, and Taylor was exiled.
And this is the fascinating part of it, right? So he basically fled to the United States, and there, Doe put out an extradition treaty, and then he was arrested and put in prison for having stolen, in theory, $900,000 worth of whatever it was that he stole, but basically for $900,000 worth of something, and for having stolen it, I think. And so, Taylor says that this was a politically trumped up charge, and this just was not the case. And, Doe obviously didn't said that it was the case. And so the United States government took Doe's side, it's difficult to say exactly what happened, but he was put in prison for it. But there's the better part of this story, which is that he escapes prison, right? Which nobody, when I first heard this, I just thought it was a conspiracy theory, right? That this could not possibly have been the case. He was put in a maximum security prison in the United States. You do not just escape from a maximum security prison in the United States. It just doesn't happen. But escape he did. And at some point, and this is where the story gets really interesting around, what happened and what didn't happen, right? So Taylor's version of the story was he was let out by the CIA because Kiyompa wanted to lead a rebellion against Doe. Doe was threatening, was making noises, making eyes at the Soviets, potentially threatening to be helpful to the Soviets and not be as closely allied to the United States as was expected of, a patronage kind of situation. And so the United States didn't like this and decided to support this rebellion being led by Kiyompa. Kiyompa goes in, somehow they're alerted, that rebellion fails, but in the lead up to planning that rebellion, Charles Taylor was supposed to be helping Kiyompa, right? So the CIA or somebody goes in, sets everything up, tells him that he's going to be released. The prison cell door is going to be open. There's an escape car for him. His wife is there waiting. And, this story, there's no reason not to believe this story because he gets out somehow. And he is supposed to fly back and help out. But the coup fails. He doesn't make it back. The next thing we know, we hear that he's in Mexico. And then the next time after that we hear about, he's in Libya.
Yes.
With Gaddafi.
Did he meet Colonel Gaddafi personally?
Oh, absolutely. Not only did he meet him, there was a whole band of revolutionaries there in the Gaddafi training camps. That is how Fode Sanko from neighboring Sierra Leone's Revolutionary United Forces, so the rebels that are fighting against the Sierra Leone government, this is where Fode Sanko meets Charles Taylor. This is also where Compaoré from Burkina Faso ends up becoming the president too. So there's a whole gang of West African revolutionaries, rebel leaders in waiting. This is where they all meet, in Gaddafi's camps.
Gaddafi is somebody that's quite hard to pin down ideologically, especially as his kind of quite long time in power continues. He was probably a sort of, an Arab socialist, an Arab nationalist when he took over. It's not obvious that's what he was by this point, by the 1980s. Was there a kind of ideology to this gabble of West African revolutionaries, or was this just a kind of power play? How ideological was Taylor, do you think?
I don't think Taylor was ever ideological. I think Gaddafi was ideological, and in the sense that, if there is an ideology here, or if there's something that bands them together, it is the overthrowing of people who have become too powerful, right? And I think that's the lens through which you can see the commonality of their cause. If you want to be generous about it, if you don't want to be generous about it, then they're basically there to take whatever resources they can from Gaddafi, and then Gaddafi has a friend in the region, right? So I would call Gaddafi a a Pan-Africanist, hoping to unite all of the continent together. In both his vision as being a kind of socialist revolutionary, and to some extent he succeeded in Libya in achieving that. And he wanted to export, and literally I think it was called the Bureau for the Export of Revolution, or something like that. But there was literally a bureau named that, so that he could achieve these ends throughout the continent, right? So he had his own ideas about state building and how to export those concepts across the continent.
So how do we end up in a situation then whereby Samuel Doe, the leader of Liberia since 1980, ends up becoming unseated from power at the end of the decade and ultimately executed?
Oh, that is an ugly, ugly story. So through the 80s, things become rather difficult. And Doe himself is, like I mentioned, becoming increasingly paranoid. So initially when he came into power, people really underestimated him. He wasn't even supposed to be in the top job. He was just a front man. It was Kiompa who was the power behind the scenes. And Kiompa didn't want his own head to be chopped off, so he put Doe on the throne. But then, of course, Kiompa ended up becoming a threat, and so Doe had to eliminate the threat, and he grew into that role. But as a result, he became very paranoid about power, and rightly so, right? Like there were plots to overthrow him. But then the problem was that he responded by violently cleansing everybody in the population that was related to those ethnic groups. And things got really violent. And this is also where you see in that period where, people like Ellen Johnson Sirleaf are upset, like, leaders abroad who are outside of Liberia, and there are close links with the US, right? So there are lots of Liberians living outside of Liberia, and they are upset about what's going on, as are Liberians within the country. So you can sort of see this movement against Doe building up, and, Taylor plays right into that. He starts setting up the NPFL, the National Patriotic Front for Liberia, and then in 1989, he's relying on help from the neighbors, and that there are lots of fascinating stories around the relationships with the neighbors as well, right? So in part, some of that comes from Gaddafi. In part, these are personal relationships and older grudges that have lasted throughout the region. So he goes into, he launches his attack from Cote d'Ivoire, and that's because Houphouët-Boigny, who was the reigning regional, I would say, sort of elder statesman, he had held a grudge against Samuel Doe from something that happened when Samuel Doe, won his coup, right? So because of that, he is now willing to help Taylor, right? Basically as an act of revenge. So they're coming in from Cote d'Ivoire, from the north into Nimba County. You've got Burkina Faso, also very close by, and the friends that he had met from the Gaddafi era, and also because Charles Taylor's MPFL had helped those rebels win in Burkina Faso. So Compaoré is now in power there, right? So now you've got two states, and then you've got arms coming in from Libya. So you sort of see like how this is all coming together. And then he invades from the north, and he picks up people as he goes along, right? So it's not a coincidence that he's coming in through Nimba County, because this is where all of that ethnic violence was occurring. So he's picking up people as he's going along, and he's saying, we are going to overthrow Doe. And he's got a very receptive audience for that. And that's how the Civil War begins.
I want to try and fill in a bit of Taylor's personality at this point, because he's only probably 40 by this stage, by the end of the 1980s, and he's gone to university in the States, escaped a maximum security prison, met Colonel Gaddafi in Libya, and has instigated revolutions in multiple countries in West Africa. Discuss.
What
was he?
Of chaos. Well, look, to give him credit, he's incredibly charming, you know, and he is the right person in the right time, and arguably trying to do things that maybe needed to be done in a way, right? I don't think that the Taylor that we know today needed to be this version of Taylor, right? I think he could have turned into another version of Taylor under different circumstances. I think he could have been more of a Paul Kagame, as brutal as he may be, or a Museveni, as brutal as he may be, right? Like, it's not like those two leaders are, don't have a lot of blood on their own hands, but they are not seen in the same way as we think about Charles Taylor. And certainly they are not being held culpable for the things that they have done in the way that Charles Taylor is being held culpable. I think that, a constellation of factors made Taylor into the person that he was as a result of the way in which this particular war was fought and the response that came from overseas, right? So filling in some of his personality, I think you have to give credit to the fact that he's a very talented communicator. He was always able to speak to the international media in a way that was very convincing. And he had the support of the United States for a reason. This is not a coincidence, right? He was good at what he did. He was able to inspire people, as many great dictators do. And he became more and more brutal through the war. And I think there were a couple of moments during the war, but there was a moment where I remember, and again, it's hard to know whether or not these stories are true, but in one account of the Civil War that I had read, the U.S. had promised that he would become president in relatively short order. I think when he controlled almost all of the country, everything except for a core bit in the capital, right? And it's absolutely
so this was
the capital.
This was after Doe had been executed?
This is after Doe. This is not after Doe. This is basically, you've taken, so in 1989, I think, they enter, and then very, very shortly thereafterwards, I think within 8 months, they're controlling about 60% of Liberia's territory. And then there's a period where everything that's critical is controlled except for Monrovia, right? So then what ECOWAS does is the economic group of the West African states, they come together and they say, hey, we need peacekeepers to come in because it's getting out of control. And then the peacekeepers, they put in this monitoring group, right? This armed monitoring peacekeeping group. First time it's ever being done outside of the UN. They bring, they're basically Nigerian peacekeepers with a smattering of Ghanaians and other countries from West Africa, but primarily Nigerians. They come in, they're supposed to keep the peace. They're really controlling Monrovia. That's about it. And then you have this fighting going on. But what was promised to Taylor during that time, because he controlled most of the country, basically was on the verge of taking over. The Americans were going to give it to him, in theory. We don't know if this is true. And then they reneged, right? And he turned into from that point on, the war just continued. And he had to find other means to fund the war. Things became more brutal. You just see this disintegration of what was left of the state. You see all of these different factions rising up. You see the NPFL, Taylor's group, splintering. You see different factions on the other side, splintering off. And this is when things get really bloody and very, very tangled and confused. And just groups forming and reforming, people fighting each other. You have all sorts of just really, really terrible atrocities happening. This is when you see some of the most bloody photos from that period of the Civil War.
Well, this is the remarkable thing, really, I suppose, is that you've spoken there that Taylor was basically in control of most of the country by the end of 1989, but the war persists until 1996. Taylor doesn't actually become president of Liberia technically until 1997. It sounds as if, in hindsight, what you're saying is that actually the end of 1989, the Americans kind of had maybe they didn't know it at the time, but they had the opportunity actually to bring an end to this violence by installing Taylor. Is that basically your view, that actually this, in hindsight, this was a kind of, pivotal moment?
So the war starts on Christmas Eve in 1989. So I would say, I think all of this happens, basically finishes up that kind of all the big skirmishes are done, and you've got major control of territory. They're just kind of marching through the country, and by the summer of 1990, Taylor has controlled quite a large portion of Liberia. And then after that, that's when all of the factional fighting really kicks in.
But do you think the Americans have a certain degree of blame attached to them here for sort of turning their backs on this country?
That's another question. About turning their backs is another issue altogether. But would we have gotten less violence and fewer people killed if Charles Taylor had been allowed to take over as was intended? I think the answer to that, my guess is yes. I don't think we would have ended up. I think we would have ended up with other kinds of violence. I think we would have ended up with something that looks more like a Kagame kind of rule or a Museveni kind of rule, but not this kind of long, drawn out, very, very bloody and violent civil war beyond the number of people that had already been killed, which was, horrendous as it was, right? But it went on for quite a bit longer after that. So I think, yes, I think some of the worst of the violent excesses could have been curbed.
Can you? I mean, this is the really awful part of the discussion. I mean, can you go into the details of some of these atrocities? I've sort of had a look online at them, and they're awful, and awful, if nothing else, for the number of different methods of terror that Taylor deployed.
So I don't actually think that what happened in Liberia is unique to Liberia in this sense, right? There were lots of, and there still are, even today outside of Africa, lots of leaders and lots of wars that are fought in this very brutal way. I mean, I can say a little bit, yes. So, but I'm going to give a caveat at the end of doing so, right? So,
yep.
And I think the caveat is really important. So, things were being done like having babies being cut out of pregnant mothers. People were being just routinely shot on the street. Very slight provocations. A lot of this, some of this was drug fueled as well. There were a lot of children also involved as child soldiers. So this was one of the great wars that was known as one that had a lot of child soldiers taking part in it. And in part because, a lot of these kids saw Charles Taylor as a bit of a father figure. But there was a lot of rape. But there's still a lot of rape. So it was worse during the war, but, the context of rape in this sort of situation was even more horrific than I think we can really appreciate from a position of peace, certainly. But torture was pretty routine, and I think Charles Taylor could literally just decide your fate by pointing, by just telling somebody to execute you right in front of him, and there was no sense of, there was no trial, there was no hearing for you. It was a very brutal war, and people were killed for all sorts of reasons, not necessarily any that made any sense, right? So there was a lot of vigilantism. People were killed for reasons that often just don't have any rationale either, right? So I think the violence was much more routine and much more in your face and on the streets than we could ever possibly imagine. But I think the comment about about violence and thinking about violence is also important, right? Like what I'm wary of and what I've become more wary of over time is to, I don't want to give the impression that Africans or Liberians in particular are more violent necessarily than any other group that commits horrible atrocities during war. There was less discipline. I completely agree with that. Less professionalization of the fighting forces. And that fundamentally led to, my guess is, more atrocities that occurred. And sometimes committing atrocities, as my colleague at King's writes about, Kieran Minton, committing atrocities can be part of a socialization ritual as well, right, to help you integrate yourself into the group. But having said that, I think I worry that we stereotype Africans as being particularly barbaric or brutal. And we can see, just based on what's been happening in Bucha with the Russian troops in Ukraine right now, there are some pretty terrible things happening there too. We can also see those terrible things happening in Bosnia. We can see the terrible torture that is happening in Myanmar, right? We can see what's happened with the US and the torture of detainees in Guantanamo Bay, right? This is part and parcel of how wars are fought, is torture and atrocities and rape, sexual violence, all of that stuff. You know, we can talk about degrees of it, and we can talk about disciplinary issues, but it was terrible. But I want to put a kind of wrapper around that to say, hey, let's think about how we talk about these things. But
other things are terrible as well.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I want to return to the issue of how Taylor is remembered, and remembered as well as a war criminal, as he's actually been, convicted as. He eventually managed to kind of consolidate some extent of power, formal power within Liberia, and he was elected president of the country in 1997. But that's not the end of conflict and civil war within Liberia. And ultimately, he has to resign from the presidency, from power in 2003. What goes wrong over the course of the next 6 years that means that Taylor has to resign the position that he's been fighting for over a decade?
So the crazy thing is that he was elected, right? You would expect that if you've got a warlord who's been committing all of these atrocities and abuses over the past 8 years, you wouldn't want to elect somebody like that, and yet people did, right? And part of that obviously was Taylor had quite a bit of control over the media space, but the campaign, the voting itself was fair, and there were election observers there to watch all of that, but he controlled a lot of the narrative. And then the other thing that's really important to bear in mind is people were sick of fighting. And so they thought that if they elected him and just gave him what he wanted, that the violence would end, right? So we're trying to rationalize, like, why would people do something like this? And there was, his great campaign slogan, he killed my ma, he killed my pa, I'll vote for him. Right? That was his campaign slogan. And you think, that makes no sense. That sounds absolutely crazy. Why would you do that? But the reason for it, I think, if you look deeper into those words, what they're really saying is this person is really strong. In spite of the fact that he killed my mother, in spite of the fact that he killed my father, he's strong enough to rule this country, and he's basically going to do it anyway. So, it's a combination of coercion and intimidation in his campaign slogan. You better vote for me or else. And they did. And then I think people hoped that there would be a peaceful period. But of course, who gets left out of this political settlement, right? The Krans and the Mandingos, basically the folks that were allied with people who, were working with Doe, right? So all of the people that Taylor kicked out are really unhappy because they've been left out. of the new political settlement, and they want back in. How do they do that? Well, they basically go away and they rearm. They sit on the borders and they wait. They wait for their moment. In '99, they're coming in now from Guinea, and then they're coming in from Cote d'Ivoire, right? So you get the two coming in together. Now they decide that they are going to together throw Taylor out of power, and Taylor himself is very brutal, right? So people do not support him and how he is ruling because he's not really changed his ways. He is still causing chaos in the region, notably in Sierra Leone. So all of that means that people don't want him in power. But you get the violence continuing and returning, and basically from '99 until 2003. So you had this kind of briefly peaceful period, '97 to '99, really, and then the war kind of gets going again in '99, and it really culminates in this big battle in Monrovia in 2003, and then out of the back of that, you have the peacekeepers coming in. Well, you have Taylor is convinced to leave, to go into exile in Nigeria, and you get the Americans saying to him, it's time to go, and that really is the end of him. So he leaves, goes into exile in Nigeria, and then you have the peacekeepers coming in again from ECOWAS, and they take over for a short period before the UN peacekeepers come in. And the UN people, it's basically the same peacekeepers, and they just put on different hats, right? So they go from wearing the ECOWAS hats to wearing the UN hats, and then you get a few more coming in. You get at that time, it was the world's largest peacekeeping mission at that moment. So you get a lot of international political attention and political will trying to deal with this issue once and for all. And that really changes the dynamic of things, right? So, that is a big political moment. And then from then on, I think Liberia has been able to turn itself around, which is amazing, because I don't think anybody expected that. It was very, very uncertain, very touch and go for a few years.
You mentioned that once Taylor resigned in 2003, he went to Nigeria briefly. How was he eventually apprehended after this awful decade or more of violence and of ultimately, as we found out when he was tried, breaking international law? How was he brought to justice?
Oh, this is where Taylor really earns his name as the great escape artist. Right? So what happens during this period, and again, there are lots of versions of this story because it's hard to confirm, but he's in Nigeria in a villa, and he's being put there, and he's supposed to stay there. But this is done by a promise from Obasanjo, president of Nigeria at the time. And Obasanjo promises him, we will take care of you. We won't let you be taken, right? But on the other hand, the other thing that's happening at the same time is Ellen Johnson Sirleaf really needs for Liberia's loans to be forgiven. So she is now president, and she also is trying to resist bringing Taylor back into the conversation, right? So she's trying to stay away from this. But in order for her to get these loans forgiven, the U.S. government is demanding that she request that Taylor be brought to justice. And she doesn't really want to do this, but she needs this to be done in order to get these loans forgiven. And then there's a state visit going on to Nigeria, and the president doesn't really want to do this either because he's made this promise to Taylor, but he has to break this promise in order to make the state visit happen. So what he does, I think, because how else is this? You'll see in a moment, it unravels really strangely, right? So Taylor finds out that he is going to be given up, but Obasanjo does not want to be the person that gives him up because he's got a credibility problem, right? He has his reputation to maintain as an African statesman, right? His word is his bond. So what is he going to do, right? Because all of a sudden, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf has demanded for Taylor to be extradited. So now Obasanjo has to comply. And he does, but now, what do you do with, he can't have it both ways. So he tells Taylor, I think this is what happened. Somebody tells Taylor that he's going to be extradited. So Taylor makes a run for the border. Right. And what we know is where he gets caught. He gets caught at the Cameroon border, and there's a lot of money in the trunk and in the boot, and depending on who you believe, maybe some drugs as well. Right? We don't know who to believe on that one, but there's certainly a lot of money. People say that he was arrested by the border guard when he was trying to cross the border, and again, he's almost escaped. Right? So, and there is again a big question out there, and conspiracy theories abound, but one of them is that the border guard screwed up. The border guard should have let him go, and the question is whether or not that border guard is still alive for having screwed up. Or maybe the theory was that this is exactly how it was intended. He was supposed to be caught, and this is exactly what was supposed to happen, so that Obasanjo could have his cake and eat it too. Right? So this is what I mean by West African politics is very murky, right? The things that happen, and the things that happen around Taylor in particular, are very murky. But those are the stories that are out there about what happened to him. So he gets caught, apprehended at the border. The state visit with the U.S. president goes on, and he gets flown. He has to first be flown back into Monrovia. But people are so terrified because they think Taylor has superpowers, right? So this is another discussion already, but they think he has juju. And so people are really scared. So he just basically touches down, changes helicopters, and then gets flown to The Hague. And then, from that point on, we get the trial.
The ultimate part of the trial, I think I'm skipping ahead one trial too many, actually. He's obviously ended up in Falkland Prison in Durham. Now, what was he actually tried for in the end?
Well, he was tried for war crimes, not in Liberia, and I think that's the most interesting thing, right? He was tried for the war crimes that were committed in Sierra Leone. That's unusual, right? So there was an 11 count indictment against him for crimes against humanity, violations of the Geneva Conventions, and for war crimes, and for sponsoring the RUF and the Armed Forces Revolutionary Council. So, this is unusual, right? To have a headed state be brought to trial. That's the first thing that's very unusual. And then the second thing that's unusual about this is he's not being taken to trial for what he did in his own state, but what he did in a neighboring state. So he was sentenced to 50 years in the end. And he appealed that, but he lost. So he was found guilty of aiding and abetting war crimes.
How do you explain the fact that he was never brought to trial for anything he actually did in Liberia? What do you think is going on?
That's really funny, because I went back to give a series of book talks in Monrovia for my book, Extralegal Groups in Post-Conflict Liberia. This is back in 2018. And I was consistently asked, almost at every opportunity in public, what do you think should happen around trials, right? So should we run a series of trials to hold people accountable for what happened? And I would say to that's really up to the Liberian people, right? So this is a really difficult one, because you're trading off, in some cases, if you're trying to do it right after the end of the war. If you tried to do this in 2004, 5, 6, I think it would have been very difficult and potentially quite destabilizing. That doesn't mean that the country wouldn't have gotten through it. It just means that it would have caused some degree, maybe a lot, of political upheaval, and people were scared of the possibility of returning to war, right? So they didn't want to risk that. And so maybe that was the reason why it didn't happen then. And you can see in some cases, people get brought to justice decades after the crimes are committed. And I think that might still be the case in the future for Liberia. Maybe the country is ready now. Maybe the country will be ready in 10 years or 20 years. maybe the country will never do it. But it's really ultimately up to Liberians.
My last episode I put out was about Slobodan Milosevic, who was as far as war criminals go, was, and I'd say this flippantly, but a sort of contemporary of Taylor's, a close contemporary, and it struck me how the idea of kind of war crimes against humanity, bringing heads of state to justice in this way is still a very new thing. We haven't been doing it for very long. In light of that, how do you think the international community is doing at bringing genocidal maniacs into this kind of legal framework? Because it's simultaneously very easy, at least, to bring cases against them for these things, but it's also very, very difficult to prosecute them, partly because of what the likes of Taylor and Milosevic do is so awful. How do you think we're doing?
Oh, I think fundamentally that all of these kinds of trials are political in nature, right? So you only get tried at the International Criminal Court at least mostly up to this point, if you're an African nation, right? If you look at the ICC indictments, if you look at the ICC cases and prosecutions, they are almost all completely Africans, with, I think, in more recent years, a couple of exceptions, but basically Africa looks at this and says, you're out to get us and only us. And as a result of that, you have Africans saying, we should leave the ICC, right? We should leave this institution because nobody else ever gets charged except for us, right? So that doesn't, I think we have to decide, should we let the perfect be the enemy of the good, or does consistency matter here, right? So if you're only going after particular people who suit particular political agendas, and some would say this is really, whoever does or does not suit the Western agenda does or does not get prosecuted, then you're creating an institutional problem for yourself of credibility for justice.
I don't know the answer to this, so I'm going to ask. I'm just asking you. Milosevic and Ratko Mladic, the Bosnian Serbs, this didn't happen to them?
They were tried not under the ICC because the ICC hadn't come into effect as yet. So they were tried as part of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, right? The ICTY. I hope I've got that acronym right, but the ICTY. And, we had one for Rwanda, the ICTR, so we have these kinds of, and same thing with Sierra Leone, right? So that did not happen under the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which is situated in The Hague. These other ones are these kinds of hybrid courts, sometimes made up of international judges, or not, right? So you kind of get these different configurations of dealing with war crimes. So the question, though, in theory now we're past that because we've got the ICC. Everything is supposed to go through the ICC, and the ICC is a complementary court, right? So it depends on how well your country and your national institutions and your legal system can deal with trying somebody for war crimes. So to the extent that you are already doing that, then there should be no need for an ICC, right? If your country is already dealing with that. So this is a really difficult one.
Are there people are there leaders over the last sort of 15 years in the world that you think should have been tried by the ICC that haven't been?
Oh, that's a really difficult one. I'm sure the answer is yes. There are always people committing, there are always countries that are doing things that they're not supposed to do. And the question is, what constitutes a war crime? And under what circumstances well, how far up the chain of command do you want to go, right? Do you go all the way up to the president? So if you look at some of the things that have happened in Afghanistan in recent years, or in Iraq, like let's just take for example, what has happened with some of the detention facilities that have been run by the Americans, right? That is run by the Americans. What do you do with that, right? How far up that chain do you go? Do you say, well, George W. Bush himself signed off on torture? I'm sure that I doubt that was the case, although we know that Dick Cheney had something to do with signing those orders.
Well, if even if they didn't sign them, they did publicly endorse them. I think Bush, when he was asked once what he thought of torture, he said, "Hell yeah, we'll do it." Right.
Well, this is the difficulty, right? But he can sign off and say, yes, I agree with it in principle. But you'd have to draw, as we were discussing earlier, right? You'd have to draw that chain of responsibility and say, he authorized for this particular thing to happen. And so you have to create that chain of responsibility, and then you'd have to take this person to court. And I don't have a great answer to this as somebody who, doesn't work in this way on these issues. But I can say without a doubt that there are lots of people around the world, lots of leaders, lots of both rebel groups on the one hand and, military officers, generals, whoever it may be, state and non-state actors on both sides who have done things that should be prosecuted as a war crime or as crimes against humanity and have not been, right? For a whole variety of political reasons that make a lot of sense maybe in the larger scheme of things. But also it's just not practical to try and do it. It's really, really hard to get a prosecution through.
That's a fascinating topic. I'd love to talk more about that. We're running out of time. I just want, on a slightly lighter note, I want to talk about Liberia now. Liberia is now governed by a man that was also a non-state actor for a very long time, as the footballer George Weah. You sort of suggested that actually Liberia has had something of a flourishing since Taylor left office in 2003. You're interested fundamentally in state building. In the kind of post-Taylor era, what elements of state building in Liberia do you think have actually worked?
I think the number one success has been peace. And you can't take that for granted. I think we sort of do, because we have, the proof is in the pudding, right? You have a peaceful society. And so we say, oh, of course it was always going to be like that. But it wasn't. And, I was there in 2005 in the lead up to the elections. I was back again in 2007. It was not inevitable. And we should never take that for granted. Recurrence of war is as much the norm as anything else. There were 17 peace agreements leading up to the one that finally succeeded, the Accra peace agreement that was signed in 2003, right? So if you think about state building just from the most basic level, right? Let's just talk about the absence of violence and being able to, have some control over the coercive elements in your society, right? Being able to control your police and your military at a minimum. In that sense, I think Liberia has succeeded, and that's just nothing to be scoffed at. I am somebody who's been deeply critical of the corruption problems in Liberia and a lot of other issues in Liberia that could definitely do with some help, right, on the policy side. But having said all of that, I think it has been a huge success. You go to Liberia now, and in the streets of Monrovia, things look so different from how they looked in 2005, right? Never mind, throughout the war. But even in the short time in the past, 15 years, you can just see a flourishing. And it's monumental. It's monumental. The country has changed in such a positive way over the past 20 years that you would never be able to recognize it as the same place at all. Mind you, the countryside, the more rural parts of Liberia still need incredible development are incredibly poor. The roads are terrible. There is no access to services. People do not expect much of the state. There's a long, long way to go. But I think the number one thing that has been achieved is peace and some degree of stability. People are not talking about a return to war and fearful in the same way. And you can sort of measure that in investment, right? Are people willing to build houses? And, for a period, people were not really willing to invest because they were just worried that it would be destroyed or taken away. There's no point in doing so. And then when people feel more secure, you can see that money flowing back into the country and you see things being built. And that's basically what you see now in Monrovia. People would not be doing that if they didn't have faith in the future. And I think that's just been the most incredible success.
Christine, thank you very much. That was great. Before you go, is there anything that you'd like to promote while you're here? Any books that you're working on? Any journal articles? Where can people find the stuff that you've already written?
So if people are interested in Liberia, my book is called Extralegal Groups in Post-Conflict Liberia. Trade Makes a State, and it's available probably on Amazon, and it's published by Oxford University Press, so you can probably get it on their website as well. I write a lot on state building and on peace building and on war to peace transitions, and I've done other things, and I'm happy to send you some of the links if there's a place to post them. But otherwise, people can follow me on Twitter. I love commenting on politics, British politics, American politics, African politics of all kinds. And I love just really getting into the depths of conflict and thinking thoroughly about what the aftermath of conflict is and could be, and how politics plays out in these situations. So yeah, I'm happy to engage on Twitter and other forums.
Thank you, Christine.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and, for good measure, leave us a review. You can also follow The Hated and the Dead on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, so you never miss new content.